Hey guys, what's up? Pop culture is a combination of a lot of different genres and a lot of different mediums, entertainment mediums, and some basic genres that kind of sometimes go together and sometimes are separate, but they're all prevalent in this thing we call pop culture. And over the years, pop culture has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger with the popularity of Comic Cons as cosplay and movies, books, comics that are just coming out all over the place, manga, anime, all over the place, all over the world. And there's a lot of big new fans that are really passionate about pop culture. And because it's such a wide variety of genres, like what is the prime genre? What is the best genre, right, of pop culture? Or what is even the prime genre of pop culture? You could say, there's some fantasy, there's some sci-fi, there's science fantasy. You could say there's some romantic aspects to it. There's urban fantasy. There's a ton of stuff, and there's things that are in comic books, there's things that are in manga and anime. There's things for kids, and there's also things for adults. There's even like something from Disney could be in pop culture. It's just a big combination of a lot of different things, including art. And art, basically fantasy art and manga art and fan art and stuff like that. So what is the best genre of pop culture? Well, I'm going to say one of the premium genres, the prevalent genre of pop culture. I think that is the main genre that all other genres also combined, like also have aspects of and elements of, is fantasy. And I think fantasy is the prime genre of pop culture. There's a lot of other genres that go in there, but fantasy in a lot of different forms, I think, is something that's common to a lot of different genres in pop culture. A lot of stuff is science fiction, but a lot of stuff is science fiction and fantasy. A lot of stuff is manga and anime, and most of that stuff is like an urban kind of fantasy or urban kind of sci-fi fantasy and stuff like that. Most anime happen in Japan or somewhere in the world or whatever. A lot of mangas happen sometimes in the future, sometimes in other like worlds or whatever it is, but they're all very, very heavily fantasy. It's not all fantasy, but it's very, very heavily fantasy. And whether that pop culture is coming from comic books, movies, or books, or art and cosplay and all of these different aspects of pop culture, I think fantasy is the main one. Whereas like every other genre that you find in pop culture has some traits of fantasy in it. And I think also that with fantasy, it's like sort of like the entryway into pop culture. If you have something, a piece of entertainment or some kind of story, whatever it is, if it's fantasy related, it's very, very Comic-Con friendly. And a lot of people will like to like cosplay that. Even video games that are in Comic-Cons are pretty much fantasy based, because video games, the thing about video games and fantasy is that they're best with fantasy, because like people play video games to escape and go to other worlds and play in other realities and things like that, and it's just so easy to make a fantasy video game. I mean, there's a lot of video games that are not fantasy. There's some sci-fi video games like Halo, right? And there's some like shooting video games which are like army based, and those are pretty cool. The Call of Duty games. And the Call of Duty games are pretty much not fantasy. I mean, you could say that it borders on the fantastical, because like a lot of the weapons you get in Call of Duty are not like real weapons, and the missions are just a little bit fictional, but I think that's more of like a military, like army fiction rather than an army fantasy. So yeah, because it's a shooter, so you can have the Wild West shooter, because it's a shooter. You can have the sci-fi shooter because it's a shooter. Like Halo is a shooter, and you could do like anything with a shooter. That can be in any genre. That's the thing about shooters and pop culture, video games, is that they can be any genre and they'll be just as much fun, because the whole point of the game is to shoot stuff. Just like driving games, right? It could be like in any genre. You could be flying a spaceship, you could be driving a car, you could be driving a car with machine guns on the front, or flying an airplane, or like flying, basically a battleship, or shooting from an airplane, or a helicopter or something like that. And because of the whole, it's something like people get to do things in games that they don't really get to do every day. Like in a game, it's very accessible. You can go into that game and you can like fly a helicopter, right? in reality, you have to basically pretty much get helicopter lessons and fly with someone that's an accredited helicopter teacher to actually learn how to do a helicopter, because it's not that easy probably, and you definitely don't want to do it by yourself because it could be dangerous, right? But what's interesting about pop culture is that, like, little by little, Comic-Cons and conventions got more and more popular, and they have specific conventions in pop culture, but basically a lot of the things in these conventions are fantasy based. And so, like, Dragon Con, obviously the main thing with Dragon Con is like classical fantasy. It's sort of like a lot of role-playing games, a lot of classic fantasy video games, a lot of classic fantasy cosplay. People that are into the whole kind of Dragon Con, it's more of like a medieval fantasy element, kind of a convention, whereas like a Comic-Con is more very, very open to a lot of different influences in culture, in movies, in stories and books, in comic books. Because you're gonna go to a Comic-Con and see people from every single movie that had like a sci-fi or fantasy element. So people like dressed like Alien and Predator, Back to the Future, even though like that was like a comedy sort of like sci-fi fantasy movie, you're gonna have that. You're gonna have that. And then this goes all the way back to, think about it, like Star Wars, which is 1977 is when the first Star Wars came out. But it even goes further back. I mean, like, superheroes started, I don't know, with the beginning of comic books or something. I mean, there was an old black and white TV show with Superman back in the 40s or something like that, right? And comics go back to the 30s and 40s with superheroes. And I think that Superman was the early 20th century, like all the way back in the 20s or 30s or whatever it is, but all the way back. And people still dress up as Superman or Batman. Superheroes is another genre which is prevalent in fantasy, prevalent in pop culture, and it's a big genre. It's huge because I think the reason superheroes are so prevalent is because as kids, we all loved superheroes. I don't know any kid did not like superheroes, right? I guess when people grow up, there's other things they get into. Some people stay into superheroes, right? But a lot of people get into other things. But, superheroes is something where it's going to appeal to children, and it's going to appeal to people who just stayed in that genre. And that's one kind of a genre that they have. But the superhero genre is pretty much fantasy based. Superheroes are not sci-fi. They're not based on science in any way. They try to explain it scientifically, but it doesn't really explain it scientifically. Oh, Superman is powerful because he's next to a yellow sun, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? But whatever, it's a fantasy idea, and so it works. They put that in the story and it's done. Batman is a billionaire who's trying to fight crime, and he's got this cave, and he's got all these different gadgets and cars and airplanes and things like that. And he's got assistants and all kinds of different stuff. And he, basically goes after, like villains that sort of like are also kind of like masked villains. They're all different characters of villains. And it's an interesting idea. And I think it's probably the best idea in superheroes. But then honestly, like, you could take that to the next level and go Netflix superheroes, the ones that are on Netflix, the Marvel superheroes, Iron Fist, Daredevil, The Punisher, like all of these guys, those are great series, and people are going to dress up like superheroes. They're going to dress up like The Punisher and stuff like that, and they're going to buy artwork from The Punisher and from Daredevil and from Iron Fist and all the different genres in pop culture. So you'll notice that if you go through any artist alley in any convention, you're going to notice that basically the people in that artist alley, what they're drawing is what the convention is about, because they know people are going to buy the art that reminds them of their favorite genre. So it's going to be art from manga, from anime, from comic books, from old movies. I mean, even there's still people buying and making art with Red Sonja and Conan the Barbarian. And that went all the way back to Robert E. Howard and 1950s and whatever it is. And it's still good today. And people still today are reading new issues of Conan and new issues of Red Sonja and stuff like that. And people dressing like Conan and Red Sonja. I don't see a lot of people dressing like Conan, but I see a lot of Red Sonja, that Vampirella, Princess of Mars. People all dress like that, especially if it's like sexy girl character. People like to dress like that. And guy characters also, people like to dress like dudes and dude characters and whatever it is. And then obviously there's like aliens and there's all kinds of other genres. But I'm gonna say like the one thing, like even though there's a lot of sci-fi genre, and I'm gonna say that most anime is fantasy, most video games are fantasy, and I'm gonna say that most of the pop culture is fantasy. Even though there's a lot of other genres, because what they do with fantasy is, like with urban fantasy, they mix it with other genres. They mix it with the Wild West, they mix it with science fiction, they mix it with a comedy, right? They mix it with time travel, they mix it with fighting aliens, right? Whatever it is, they mix it with a lot of different aspects, but they all have fantasy elements in it. And I do think that the rise of pop culture has led to the rise of fantasy, and that's why you get like so much fantasy on Netflix, and you get like seasons of supernatural or seasons of Daredevil or Iron Fist or The Punisher or something like that. Because even though The Punisher isn't necessarily fantasy, it is a very, very like it's kind of fantasy, because the fiction is just a little bit more exaggerated in The Punisher. He's almost has a superpower, and that he's able to fight so well, that a regular person can't. So it wouldn't go as a regular fiction. His fighting ability makes it fantasy. And I think that that's the one thing, because if you look at what is pop culture, video games, manga, anime, movies, books, comics, art, most of the stuff are characters that have magic or characters made of magic. No matter what age it's for, because there's a lot of pop culture for kids and pop culture for adults and stuff. And but the one thing they seem to all have in common, obviously there's a whole lot of pop culture that's not fantasy based, that is other genres. But if you look at it, most of them have a lot of fantasy in it, and most of them have a lot of more fantasy. Even if they're mixed with other genres, they have more fantasy than other genres. So yeah, let me know what you think about this kind of thing in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you can see my other when my videos are being posted, and check out my other videos, and I will see you guys in another video later.